The Hawaii County Police Commission is on the verge of hiring a permanent chief after hearing from 8 finalists today. The 8 finalists, 2 current leaders of the department and 6 commanders from out of state, answered the same 10 questions. The most current was whether they would allow their department to assist with federal immigration enforcement.
When we as a police department have a community that can't trust us, that means they can't report crimes. That means they can't prevent themselves or their families from becoming victims. And so we need to ensure that they understand and have access to all police services, regardless of their status.
Where this gets cloudy is if something becomes anarchy, and if it is something that would harm our citizens, then it's something that we would have to get involved in to protect the citizenry. But as far as getting into the federal side of it, it would be unless I was advised otherwise by the commission, county leadership, or the legal team, I would be very, very reluctant to engage ourselves in something that's outside the scope of our primary jurisdiction.
Hear from 2 more candidates on Hawaii News Now at 6 on KGMB and K5. The commission is scheduled to meet again tomorrow.